Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt-Along. We've finished all of our blocks, and now it's time to connect everything together. Through this entire year, we've learned how to piece and free motion quilt 42 beautiful blocks. And now it's time to make our finished quilt so that we can enjoy using this wonderful quilt. So today we're going to learn how to prepare our fabric. We have some binding strips that we need to prepare. We also need to trim down our blocks so that they're ready to connect together into rows. So let's get started learning how to connect our blocks together step by step. Okay, so we have a lot of materials to work with today, and I want to kind of explain how I've prepped everything up as we go. The first thing that we're going to need is a copy of this page in your Building Blocks quilt pattern, and it's basically the layout of how all the blocks come together in the finished quilt. What we're going to learn today is how to connect two blocks together. Then you'll use that information to connect all your blocks 6 across in a row. Then you're going to take and connect the rows together, and I'm going to show you how to connect the rows in another video because we can start dealing with bulk as we connect the rows together as the quilt gets bigger and bulkier. So we'll need some tips to master that along the way. So today we're going to learn how to connect two blocks together using binding strips. So here are my strips. I'm using 1-inch strips for the back and 1.5-inch strips for the front. And the 1.5-inch strips have been pressed in half. To prepare my fabric, all I did was pre-wash, starch, and iron. And I made sure that the fabric was nice and stiff. You can see how nice and crisp that fold is. Another tip, if you really want these to be solidly put together, is after you fold, run a little line of starch, maybe with a paintbrush, right along that crease and press again. And that will definitely get that crease firmly in your fold and make it very solidly stiff and easy to work with. The reason we starch is because you don't want this fabric to be loosey-goosey and get all out of control and wobble on you as you're connecting the blocks together. What can end up happening if it does that is as you're connecting the blocks together, everything's kind of lined up and smooth right at the top of the join, but as you get down you'll see ripples happen as you get down. So it just helps you control the fabric. It helps you have a lot of stability. So I do emphasize it is a very good idea to take your yardage for your binding, and this is back binding, front binding, and also the side binding that goes around the entire quilt. You can prepare all of it at once, starch your fabric before you get started, and you're really going to have a much easier experience. Now, one other thing, you have a choice of what colors you pick for this. I decided to use blue for everything. So the blue is going to be connecting the blocks together, the blue on the front, on the back, and then it's also going to go around the whole quilt. But you could pick different colors for each one of these. You could pick, one color for the front and another color for the back and another color for the ring around. It's totally up to you. But one thing to keep in mind, you have your backing fabric, and we're going to be top stitching along the top of the binding, and it's going to show through on the front and back. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. As far as your choices go, there's a lot of choices here, but I'm going with the easiest thing simply because I know my blue thread is going to be showing up on the top and the back, and I like the idea of having the same color on the top and the back of my binding. So, all right, let's get started. We've prepared our binding. It's all cut down to size, and you can find the exact size amounts in the Building Blocks quilt pattern. And now I am ready to cut down one of my blocks, and I'm going to trim this down to exactly 8 inches. And here's the reason why. In our blocks, probably the one thing that is going to have issues is going to be this perimeter line. And you can see I didn't stitch along this perimeter line, so I have some areas that haven't been connected. There's some areas where the quilting comes and I travel stitched a little bit, but I didn't go all the way around the entire perimeter. And so when I was designing this quilt, I decided, you know what, we're going to cut these blocks down to 8 inches. And so that way, if you have any stitch issues, any mistakes within the quilting, any bird's nests, any knots right along these edges, you can cover them up in the binding, and it's a little less intimidating that those things are going to be visible in your quilt. However, that being said, we will end up covering up about 1/4 of an inch all around our block. with the binding. The binding will overlap and cover 1/4 of an inch inside of the quilting, and I think that this makes the block more secure. However, if you don't like that idea and you want your quilting to show all the way to the edges of the block, all you have to do is cut your blocks to 8.5 inches instead. That's the only modification you have to make. But I'm going to cut mine down to 8 inches simply because I like that idea of overlapping. I like the idea of my block being overlapped, the quilting being overlapped slightly, mostly because I know it will be more secure, and it will also hide any issues along that perimeter line. Okay, so now I'm going to line up, and I'm going to use the 8-inch marks on my ruler, and I'm lining up. And here's a tip: your quilting may have shrunk slightly and maybe slightly smaller than what it was originally. When you marked your block, this was 8 inches, but now the quilting has drawn it in slightly. So the thing to do is not just line up the 8-inch mark with, let's say, the perimeter line of the block. Instead, look inside of the block and double check that some of these piecing lines are lining up on some straight lines within this square. And so that's what I'm going to be lining up with. I can see that this edge should be lining up with that top of that triangle, and so that's what I'm lining up with. And that means that some of my stitching line here is inside of the 8-inch mark, and I've got about 1/8 of an inch on the opposite side of this edge, and that's because my quilting shrunk the block. Okay, so press firmly. I'm cutting left-handed right here. Make your cut right across. Now I have a corner right here, so I can just pivot around the corner and make my second cut. I really like to work off the corner of a table, so that way I don't have to flip things around so much. That's a nice tip. Okay, now I rotate the block around. Line up again, and now that I have 2 cut edges, I want to make sure that I'm cutting an 8-inch block. So I am lining up those edges on my ruler, the edges of the block with the 8-inch marks on my ruler. Press firmly and cut. Rotate my body around here, press firmly, and cut. Okay, so that's that block trimmed down. Now you might be wondering if the spoonflower blocks differ at all, and no, they do not. However, they may be slightly more likely to skew, stretch and skew, slightly out of shape. So you want to be just a little bit more mindful of that. Here I know that I want to line up, basically the 7-inch mark. We've got the 8-inch mark here. I'm going to line up the 7-inch mark along that line. That might throw some stuff off over here. So just can kind of look at it. You can give the fabric a little tug, just a gentle tug, and that can sometimes stretch the block out a little bit. But notice how the spoonflower block, it's even more shrunk in. Here's the edge of the block, and here's where I'm cutting. This is the nature of quilting, particularly when it gets dense. It can alter the size and shape of your block. Okay, so we're ready to get started connecting 2 blocks together, and I am working in this corner connecting a basket block to a house block. And basically what you want to do is take the block that is on the left, and that's the one we're going to start with first. And we're going to place the 1-inch strip to the back, layer the block on top, and the strips are intentionally cut longer than they need to be, so that way this is easier. You really want to have this extra along the edges so you have something to work off of. Okay, so 1-inch strip to the back, block in the middle, folded binding on top, and you want to make sure that the fold hangs to the left side. Just like that. You want to line everything up. I don't pen this, I just kind of generally line up the top and maybe the first inch or so, get it on the machine, and we're going to stitch this with a very accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, here we go, and again we've got the 1-inch binding on the bottom, block in the middle, 1.5-inch binding folded in half with the fold to the left, all lined up, ready to go. And I've also double checked that my block is the right orientation. If you get the binding stitched on the wrong edge, you're going to have to rip it out, because then the block will be, like in the case of this basket, it will be facing the wrong way. So double check that. If you're wanting the quilt to come out exactly like the picture, you want to double check your orientation too. Okay, so I'm stitching very slowly and carefully. Now a few things. I am using my 1/4 inch foot. I'm making sure that the fabric does not extend beyond this edge. I have also lowered my stitch length, so it's 1.5 millimeters. So I know that this is definitely a very tiny locking stitch, and it's not going to come out. I really want to make sure that I'm stitching a very tight stitch as I bind these blocks together. It's very important. You can see about every inch or so, I kind of lift the block slightly, nudge that 1 inch over, the 1 inch binding on the bottom over, making sure it's perfectly aligned with the edge of the block. Kind of press my finger down, then with my top hand, I align that top binding, making sure it's in alignment too. About every inch I stop and double check that. This is one of those techniques that you want to be very precise with. You really want to be very precise with it, because if it's off, if you get your 1/4 of an inch off, then things will just not come together as smoothly and evenly. You might have to do some trimming and some fiddling to get it to work. It's not the end of the world. If 1/4 inch is a struggle for you, I can give you some tips on making that easier. But it is really an important thing to just take your time on. See how much time I'm taking just to sew one strip. And this is another thing. Quilt as you go. We quilted all these blocks, and then now we're putting them together in a finished quilt. Just remember, there's no way to save time in quilting. And so we are going to have to put some extra time into putting these blocks together now. Okay, so we're ready to go with our block for the next step. We have our folded binding to the front. We have our 1 inch binding on the back. And I'm going to take my fingers and just finger press that 1 inch binding over. If you want to take it to your iron, you can. I usually find finger pressing works okay, and you want this to be a nice crisp fold. So, maybe even just run your thumb along it, like that. That's a nice crisp fold. That looks good to me. Okay, so the block goes like this, and it needs to connect to this house block just like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the house block and flip it under. So we have back sides together, wrong sides together, and I'm going to align this top edge so that the blocks are aligned up here at the top. And now I'm going to align that 1 inch binding, this was the 1 inch binding to the back, with the edge of the second block, that house block. When I take this to the machine, I'm going to be stitching just through the 1 inch back binding and the house block. I'm not going to be stitching through this folded binding or this basket block. So let's take it to the machine and stitch the second seam. So again, I'm making sure that the tops of the two blocks are in alignment, and the 1 inch binding is aligned nicely to the edge of that second block, the house block. It really is nice if you have a needle down option to always have your needle rest in the down position, so you can just slide your block and binding right into the machine and take the first stitch onto that binding. And this is why I cut the binding intentionally a little longer than the blocks. It just makes this go together a little easier, a little bit more control. Another thing you want to watch out for, this is kind of bulky right here. We've got several layers right here. This is the seam allowance of what we did before. And you can see my little 1/4 inch foot here perfectly fits into this channel, but not all 1/4 of an inch feet will. And if you find this a struggle, if you find your fabric's just really wobbling out of shape, a walking foot might make this easier. You might also need to lift the foot and actually be on top of that kind of ridge of cloth. So just keep that in mind. As I'm going here, I'm generally aligning, just lifting and aligning that edge of the binding with the edge of the block. Again, I don't pen this. I don't see a need to. I will be penning later whenever we connect the rows together to ensure that the blocks are lining up just right. Now when I get to about the halfway point, I'm going to back up the camera so you can see this. When I get to about the halfway point, I just go ahead and take a look at how this is all going to lay out. Are the block edges down here going to line up nicely? I'm going to stitch just a little further down. I think I'll get a better idea of this, if it's going to line up nice or if it's going to be a little off. You can see this block is just ever so slightly longer by maybe 1/8 of an inch. And here's the trick. Quilts are a little squishy. They have a little bit of give. You can just kind of tug just ever so gently on that bottom block if it's out of alignment, or the top block if it's out of alignment. I'm just going to tug that down very gently. Press with my finger down onto the machine. My thumb now, because I reposition my fingers. I'm holding it in place so that as I stitch down, those blocks will be just nicely aligned. Now, you see how the fabric's kind of winging up a little bit? It's kind of wanting to do that. I'm just holding it in place as I stitch over it. It would be even worse, kind of wiggling around and doing crazy things, if I hadn't starched the fabric. So right here, I'm just pressing my fingers down as I stitch closer and closer, and then off the block. Okay, so here's our block after we have connected two together, and I flipped it out and I kind of give them a little tug like this, and notice what happens. Those seam allowances nest beautifully together into this little channel created by that 1-inch binding. Remember, the 1-inch binding went to the back. We stitched it first on the back block, basket block. We folded it over, stitched it to the house block, and now both of those seam allowances are nesting together. They're literally butting up together in that channel. And that means that this binding is not empty. This is completely filled up. And it's nice and smooth. However, what if this isn't nice and smooth for you? What if the fabric is really kind of wanting to overlap itself, or they're just not butting up nicely together, and you're getting kind of a bulky feel to this area? Well, the easiest thing to deal with that, if that's happening to you, go on ahead and flip up that last seam that we just stitched and give it a trim. Just trim the seam allowance by about 1/8 of an inch. Just trim it down, and that should fix it. You should be able to nest those seam allowances just nicely in that little groove created by that binding on the back. Okay, so now we have some ugly seam allowance on the front. We want to cover that up so no one can see it. So we're going to take this folded binding and start folding it over. We want to take this folded binding and fold it over, and we're going to stitch this down so that it fully encases those seam allowances. And you can see, once this is stitched down, we will have the same look on the front as we have on the back. Just a 1/2 inch piece of binding. Okay, so I like to finger press this over. You know, if I have, I'll get into production and I will stitch all the front back binding to all my blocks down the row. Then I'll connect all the blocks in sets of 2, just like this. You can do 3 sets of 2. Then I'll connect those pieces together, and then after everything's connected into one long row, I'll fold all of them over at once and seal all of the seam allowances all at once. So that's my kind of production method with it. Let me show you how I seal this up. And of course, I want to emphasize that there are multiple ways of doing this. If you want this to be completely seamless with no stitching, no extra stitching on the front or the back, then you're going to need to hand bind. You will need to take needle and thread and hand bind the edge down to your block. And let me just give you a warning, this is very time consuming to hand stitch, because these might seem a little short here on the blocks, but then you'll have the whole row to stitch across. So just a warning about that. That is very time consuming. I'm going to teach you how to stitch this down on the machine. So let's get started. Okay, so here you can see my seam allowances nesting nicely together, butting up against each other. And here's my folded binding. I'm folding this over and kind of pushing it right up against that stitch line. Of course, my thread is dark, so it's kind of hard to see, but there's a stitch line right there. I'm wanting my binding to cover that, to get right up to that edge. I'm going to just hold it in place with my fingers Now I'm still using my 1/4" foot because my 1/4" foot, I really like how it has this kind of like a little groove on the inside, and I'm going to be lining up that little groove with the edge of my binding. Another foot that might be even better for this job is an edge stitching foot. It has a little blade that allows you to line up instead. So those are two options for you. But regardless, you really want to be able to line up with the edge of that fold. And then stitch about a little less than 1/8 of an inch inside of it. You want your needle to be lining up right along the edge of the fold. And you can see how that little groove in my foot is lining up with that fold, and that's how I'm able to stitch this so accurately. As I go, I'm kind of folding over, pressing with my fingertips, and then pressing down to hold it in place. If you wanted to, you could pen this. It's totally up to you. I find this just a little easier just to use my fingertips. It also helps if you actually take it to your iron and give the folded binding a good press over. That can help too. Notice how slowly I stitch this. It's not going to be something that you race through. You want to stitch slowly and carefully. And I am using a straight stitch with this. I think a straight stitch looks really nice, almost like the top stitching of your jeans, and I'm actually going to follow this up with another line of stitching so that we have 2 channels of stitching along this binding, and it actually looks very nice. Another option, if you don't like this, you could use a decorative stitch on your machine, a zigzag, buttonhole stitch. All of those ideas are open to you. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. You just want this edge nicely secure. And as much time as I'm taking to hold this down and press it in place with my fingertips, it is a lot more time consuming to do it by hand. However, if you want to, of course, that's always open to you. Stitching it down by hand will result in no stitching on the back. Here's what I mean by that. This is the back of the block, and you can see I have a line of stitching now on the back of the block, and that's what's coming through from the front. I think that this looks really nice. However, I think it looks even nicer if we balance it out with a second line of stitching to the opposite side. And we don't need to do this. This is purely decorative. It just balances it out, in my opinion. So again, I'm going to slide the block under, and this time I don't really have to be pressing or holding it or fiddling with it at all. It's already all secured. All I have to do is just buzz it through the machine, making sure that I stay the same distance away from that edge as I did the first time, so that way they're nicely balanced. So here's our 2 blocks connected together. We have this 1/2 inch binding on the front and a 1/2 inch binding on the back, and these 2 grooves of stitching. You can see how that stitching on this side, it's securing that folded edge of the binding down. On this side, it's purely decorative, just intended to match with that opposite side. And this reminds me of the top stitching on the edge of our jeans. That's what it reminds me of. That's why I like it. However, keep in mind, this is not the only way that you can finish this binding. You could hand stitch this edge. You wouldn't need to buzz it through your machine at all, and then you wouldn't have any stitching coming through to the back. Well, if you finish it on the machine, there's no getting around. You will have stitching on the back of the blocks. I think that this looks perfectly fine. As I've said before, the back of the block is the back. Don't get obsessive with it. And definitely enjoy finishing your blocks quickly by machine. So that's it for connecting our blocks together. I really hope that you've enjoyed learning this technique and that you will use it to connect all of your blocks together into rows. In our next video, we're going to learn how to connect the rows together. And it's the exact same technique. So what I'm mostly going to be focusing on is how to deal with the bulk in your small home sewing machine. I'm actually piecing all my blocks together on a Bernina 1230, an older machine with only a 6.5 inch harp. That's the space between the needle and the back of the machine. So it's a pretty small space to be fitting this whole quilt in. So I'm sure you're going to want to tune into that video and see how to connect all of those rows together and keep this quilt the most manageable as you get it all together in one piece. Of course, if you have any questions about this technique, or you want to post a photo of your alternative for Maybe sealing up that folded edge of the binding if you don't like what I've shown here in this video and you want to show off your zigzagging or buttonhole stitch or your hand binding. Definitely post them to the Free Motion Quilting Project or to the Facebook Building Block group. You can check that out at facebook.com. Of course, if you're interested in making this quilt and piecing and free motion quilting all of these beautiful blocks, you can find all of the information in the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt.